Alright, so we're going to keep video 4 on paths short and sweet. Just going to give a little bit of extra discussion to go along with our worksheet on ordered paths. That's included in the email. Make sure you find that and look it over. It has recommendations for different types of materials and setups for different paths related to our orders. So we're going to go through a few of those here and just do a little bit of brief discussion. Well, it may go without saying, but this is the main entryway into our site. It's large enough to get cars or trucks, access vehicles in. You know, a lot of places this might be gravel and that would work fine, something compacted like that. But at the same time, if you have the money to go for it, something that's probably the best value for the site, for the application, would be concrete or blacktop asphalt. Now, of course, both of those, asphalt is a little bit cheaper but doesn't last quite as long, and concrete costs more but lasts longer. Both of them are not very environmentally friendly. In my opinion, if I have the option, I would probably use a concrete. There's some cases when I wouldn't. Here it's rather nice that in the winter the blacktop has a tendency to heat up and actually melt the snow a lot more easily than it would if it were concrete. So there are some other things like that. But basically, these materials are really the best value for the application over time. So moving on to the fourth order paths that we recommended, these are secondary site access routes. They're not quite as high use as the primary ones, or maybe they're only used seasonally. That's really common, especially with farms or garden systems. Basically, you know, for something like this, if it's ephemeral or emergency access, maintaining it as gravel, probably grass is probably gonna encroach unless there's woodland there. Keeping the compaction is kind of difficult. So grass, mown grass is a really good thing, keeping it as essentially prairie that you can come in and brush hog at some point. Next up, we have the third order paths. These are main garden paths, places for tours, access, tools, equipment. The main paths around the site for foot travel, walking your dog, walking your guests, all of that. Now, in a lot of gardens and landscapes, what I've seen many times, they'll start out with an ambition to keep those all in deep wood chip mulch, and it just never works. It's a huge investment of time. They end up reinvesting in it every single year. It takes a ton of volunteers to keep going, and for the most part, all that wood chip mulch just ends up being a waste of space. For me, unless you're in a climate like a Mediterranean climate where those things can be easily maintained with like rock dust or shells, things like that, and the compaction is enough to keep the path. In those climates, you have way more options. You can do those things like rock mulch paths or shell mulch. I really love crushed shells. It's a beautiful look. In wetter climates, outside of the Mediterranean kind of climate, they're really difficult to maintain. In my opinion, grass ends up being the way to go. You can maintain it at your will. It could be you only mow it a couple times a month, depending on how formal the landscape is. In our front yard, we tend to mow once a week, all summer long. That all gets used as mulch and as fertility throughout the garden, so it's not an inch of wasted space to keep it that way. Back here, we tend to hit it maybe once a month, and that's enough to keep it looking formal enough. Our backyard is a less formal space, and that's how it's been planned. There's also, you know, this possibility for paths to become self-mulching or maintained through travel and compaction over time. Once you get into a fairly deep woodland, you actually can create paths that, through compaction and getting the soil hard and having that right, if the soil is appropriate, or you can amend it such that it's appropriate and get it nice and compacted and there's not too much organic matter, those can become self-maintaining. Paths, we're now getting down to the small access paths within the farm fields or gardens like we have here. Now, for me, what we've found is that once they get much wider than a foot or 2 feet, a foot and a half, you get enough sun infiltration into them that they're never going to become self-mulching, they're never going to become self-maintaining. But in a lot of cases, if you have the vegetation on both sides, there and there, of the path, tall enough and everything, that these kinds of paths are small enough they can largely become self-maintaining. These are kept to the size. That's one path through with my little push power reel mower. And then we have the nodes, like we've talked about on that sheet, spaced every so often, so you do have a place to work. And we'll take a look around and see that. But let's go look at a couple of different ways that we have these small access paths done back here in our less formal garden. Right? So now that we're down at this fourth order level, these small garden access paths, we're to the point where they can largely become self-maintaining. As you see here, this was done a few years ago in wood chip mulch, and since then it's just been kind of leafy debris, but it mostly maintains itself with a very, very, very minimal amount of effort, because it's also really shady woodland part of our forest garden, and it's shade crops primarily grown back here, and this works for it. And now we're down to the real micro level in our final order of paths, and here things like little stepping stones or these wood rounds just provide a little bit of a dip of access into the garden. It could provide me with a little place to step into inside a slightly larger bed in a more extensive area of the garden. Down at this scale, this kind of thing is really worth the investment to me, because this provides a way to still step into a bed and have some access that's going to last for a really long time without any kind of maintenance. And you don't have to have a perfect weed-free, mown path right here. You just need to be able to have a little bit of access. In this case, around a compost pile and some fruit bushes that I need to be able to step into in order to harvest. Now, of course, none of this is set in stone. These are just basic guidelines, a thought tool for you to use. Like with zones, it's not dogma. It's not that if you don't have your orders right, your garden is all wrong, or it's not permaculture. It's just a tool that you can use to think about. Really, all we're trying to do is match the scale and the usage to the material and to how the easiest possible way it is to maintain those paths. Because paths are a hard thing to maintain in the garden. So getting the scale right and getting the design right is really worth the time. Next, we're going to look at some alternative types of paths and access systems that can be used. They're a little more intensive, but for places where that intensive investment is really going to have a big return on investment for you.